I mean, in the case of Britain, it did happen pretty quickly. I mean, if you're going from late 70s as terminal decline and then through to Thatcher in the 80s.
It is. I mean, it's surprisingly quickly. Let's go back, actually. Decline happened after the Second World War.
True. Yeah.
And the peak of the empire was at 1914 before the war started. That was truly our ultimate power at that stage. And we gradually rolled downwards, even though after 1918 we end up with more in the Middle East, more land, access to oil. In fact, decline was already setting in. And decline of empires takes time. But for America, that decline has been taking place since, I would argue, since 1990. So we're 30 years into that process, into the terminal phases. And as the last of the Western Christian empires, it's even more vulnerable because it doesn't have another system like Britain coming up behind it. Well, we are there, but not enough. But I think, and therefore I think Brexit's role is more interesting than just a group of people that decided they wanted to be sovereignly independent and respected democracy, and they wanted to decide and break away from a moribund Europe that had lost its creativity, run by bureaucrats. I think actually it represents the desire of the larger system to perpetuate democracy and freedom. And if Britain had stayed part of Europe, it would have been locked up and there would have been not a single element available to the super Christian empire to expand or reframe. And Britain represents that offshoot to reframe of the system.
On that note, with Europe and the UK, the Eurozone in particular, and the UK breaking away from the EU. Recently, we have seen the French get embarrassed with their submarine deal with the Australians, getting sort of stolen out from under their noses by the UK, the US, and with Australia, of course. And what do you think that story says? Because to me, it does speak of a certain strike back at China, which is which I think is quite a masterstroke when it comes to nuclear submarines. I mean, what's your take on that? Because it doesn't speak to me entirely of decline.
Well, it's a really interesting piece because the Australians, much as they were in the Second World War, highly vulnerable, sitting south of Japan. And we often think about Midway as the turning point, but the Battle of the Coral Sea was the turning point when the Japanese invasion force of Australia was turned back.
Right.
And so Australia understands what it's like to be vulnerable down there in the south to an Asian power which is expanding towards you for your resources and your land access. So they've been very, very aware of their dual problem of economic dependence through resource exports to China and also China's aggression. And to give them credit, for 24 million people, they are the only country that consistently calls China out over the pandemic source. Everyone else has buttoned up, but the Australians have been sitting there saying, sorry, we don't believe it's zoonotic. And they have relentlessly done that and paid the price for it. So if they were aware of the threat before, they are super aware of the threat now because they've been threatened with nuclear war. Who knows it? All sorts of things which you think, how can you say that in public? What's interesting is their naval expansion was taking place well before that. They were anticipating this. So, for example, the Type 26 frigate order is a good manifestation. The air defense destroyers, their navy is going to be significantly of the proportion of our navy at the rate they're going. And they needed new submarines. And I remember speaking to senior officials in the government when they talked about it. And they said, well, that's interesting because when you go and buy a short-fin Barracuda submarine at 4,500 tons and turn a nuclear submarine into a conventional submarine, there isn't a big enough power source to do that. So you're always underpowered. Yep. And some of the arguments, I think, well, we can turn them nuclear and ship the contract over somewhere along the way. But they knew nuclear weapon energy at that stage wasn't acceptable to the electorate. So they went large as they could with a conventional hull, hoping the French would solve the engineering problem, which was doubtful from the beginning. And one would argue the French were somewhat optimistic to offer it. And the delays and the cost overruns come from perhaps the desire to sell something that didn't exist. So there was a vulnerability. In the meantime, since the pandemic, the electorate in Australia demands that it be defended because it sees China as an overt current and present threat. So the barrier of having a nuclear power plant disappears. So once you accept you can have a nuclear power plant, you don't want a 4,500 ton submarine, you want an 8,500 ton submarine with a greater sensor weapon suit.
Yep.
So all of a sudden you look at the contract, the French haven't delivered, it's not working, and you can build a strategic alliance by bringing America in, because if you're going to buy British submarines, you need American permission. And all of a sudden you base some of those submarines down in Perth and the whole construct changes. And of course, and to Boris's great credit, I think he really understood what that represented. The image that you were building warships like the Type 26, which would now be Astutes, and essentially you would sell product, you needed American permission for it, and you based your submarines, you forward-based them in such a way as they could threaten the choke points for the Chinese trying to get out of the second island chain. strategically brilliant. And I have to give our Boris great credit for saying yes to it, because I think many prime ministers wouldn't have done. And you can understand why America's done it and Australia's done it. It's a win-win. But there's a sad reality, and that is that our Astute program is so behind, and we're going to build 7 and they're still not rolling off, and we know 4 maybe just about, that they won't be able to build them in Australia. And unless we do something to create a national warship shipbuilding program on an emergency basis, those submarines won't even come in line in time for the time frame I'm talking about. So what are you left with? You're left with the need for an emergency shipbuilding program for the delivery to Australia, and the politicians will have to make it clear to the electorate it's too complicated to build in Australia. Impossible when you look at the complexity of those submarines. They're like building a space shuttle. They are amazing, amazing vessels. And we need an emergency shipbuilding program for our own Navy to expand along the lines I've discussed earlier, and to support allies who wish to then buy our products. We need to shift.